You're listening to the UBC Medicine Learning Network.
Before we start today's interview, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this podcast on the unceded and traditional territories of the Lheidli T'enneh, a part of the Carrier Territory. Welcome. You are listening to MEDamorphosis, a podcast where we interview physicians from across BC and Canada with the aim of helping medical students navigate their medical careers. My name is Crystal, and I am a medical student at UBC's Northern Medical Program. On today's episode, we are speaking with Dr. Allyson Wyllie, who is a newly minted PG1 of UBC's South Okanagan Family Medicine Program. She is also a recent graduate of the Northern Medical Program, and I am really excited to welcome Dr. Wyllie onto the podcast to hear about her incredible pre-med journey and her recent experience of matching to residency. On a special note, this episode is a part of a mini-series on Northern, rural, and remote medicine. We talk about everything from training up to subspecialty practice in these distinct geographical regions. Welcome, Dr. Wyllie. How does that kind of feel with people calling you that now? It's a new designation for you.
I was actually just asked this question by my new site director for Rural Family, and it's definitely something that's getting used to. I definitely don't really identify as physician yet. I think like with the pandemic and being raised kind of in low income, physicians have always had this position of power, and it's not always been like the most positive of designation. So I found myself kind of like just correcting everyone to Allyson right away, but obviously also really proud of the work and the designation that went into that.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, I could imagine how that feels 100%. Congrats on graduating from the Northern Medical Program and starting residency. I know you're just kind of the first couple weeks into it, but how's it going?
It's been going great. I'm in the Penticton South Okanagan program, and I'm originally from Penticton, so it's nice to be close to some family again and be back in my hometown. We've been primarily just kind of like doing a fair amount of orientation, and the medical community has been so welcoming, which is great. Did have my first kind of call shift on the weekend, and I have terrible call karma, so that was a bit crazy, but also really nice to get back into it after not seeing patients since March, and just really reaffirming that this is what I want to do for my career, which is a nice feeling.
That's hilarious. So you have a little bit of a dark cloud when you're on shift.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to the start because, you're at the end of your medical school career. Can you share a little bit of your background and why you chose to pursue medicine?
So it's kind of a bit of a long road that I took to medical school. I'm a mature student, but I was raised primarily, I spent a lot of time with my grandma. My mom was like a single mom, and my grandma and my great grandma had a lot of health conditions. And I remember like reading on Britannica back in the day when that was a thing before Google, and just really being interested in it. And I ended up volunteering in the hospital throughout high school as a candy striper and really loved it. And so kind of had set out to want to do family medicine. I had approached my counselor in high school and spoke to her about it because I knew I needed to change one of my courses to include some chemistry. And she told me, given who my family was, that she didn't think that was a reasonable path to pursue and I should go into the trades. And at the time, I had an A plus in chemistry and a D in like mechanics slash woodworking. So it's just kind of funny how, like, back in 2005, that really defined kind of who went into medicine. But I'm really stubborn. And as soon as someone tells me I can't do something, I decided screw it. So I went to someone else and got them to approve the change and entered biochemistry at UVic. And I was super determined to do medical school, had learned that kind of co-op and honors was the best way. But unfortunately, while I was in my undergrad, I got pretty sick. I was born with a hole in my heart from an identical twin and ended up having an arrhythmia as well. And it took kind of 4 years to really get diagnosed and treated. And I was not medically cleared to even apply to school. I had reached out to them about it. So I decided kind of during that time, I really wanted to be invested in how the health system works. I kind of had been also really disenfranchised with our healthcare system. I kind of equally was both so grateful that everything was paid for regarding all of my visits, but also just so disappointed at like all of the waits and how terribly women were treated. I'm a pretty petite person and had gained 10 pounds and was told it's because I'm fat, and I was like of a BMI at 22 at the time. Like just weight bias galore in it. And so that's kind of what led me to do my master's of health administration. Is I just said, well, okay, I'll pursue a career related and do that. And so through my master's of health administration, really came to understand like what the system constraints are, how big Canada is as a geography, and really kind of developed like a lot more empathy for what physicians go through. And so that kind of led to my work with physicians, and then really kind of lended well to being a physician advocate. I kind of wanted to join Doctors of BC because I had the mindset, if you can't beat them, join them. And really got to kind of know so many physicians and realize that a lot of times physician bad days aren't because of them as a person. It's because of the system constraints or what they're expected to deal with, or the pushing of resiliency when the system doesn't allow for it. Of course, there's still those physicians that are always not your favorite people, but really realized it was like an amazing profession. And that's what led me to apply to medical school. Being a mature student, I had a pretty easy journey, luckily, and just decided on a whim to sign up for my MCAT after a couple of glasses of wine. And a year later, I started. So
Wow.
I took the leap at 30 and really glad I did.
I just want to applaud you. And like, first time I talked to you, I kind of just stuck with me, your story, because it is very similar to my own. I also started medical school in my 30s. And I just, I really recognize how much hardship and how much time it took to get to where you are. So it's hard. It's so hard. And the older you get, it can be even harder to keep moving forward with your dreams. So good for you. I just wanted to linger on kind of a little bit more of the details of you kind of taking steps along the way. Did you find that like when you finished your undergrad and you wanted to pursue medicine, that wasn't able to happen? Where did your mindset kind of go? How did you kind of keep the faith that you could move forward with medicine?
To be honest, it was such kind of a challenging time that I think I was just in survival mode. Like at the time, I had kind of a lot of like family stuff going on. And as I mentioned, I was from like a really low socioeconomic status. So I wasn't going to get any family support. So at the end of the day, I had to pay bills. And the only one that was going to be responsible for that is me. And I was really hesitant to like go on disability just because of how my family was treated ever being on medical EI or welfare, and it just had a really negative connotation with it. And so at the time, I knew the only thing I could do was sit down and do a job. And luckily, kind of as I was going through some of my medical stuff, one of my neighbors was a physician who was about to open up her own practice, and her MOA was actually that she had hired was going on maternity leave. And so that's how I kind of got that job. And I knew it was going to be enough to kind of get me by. And so from there, I knew that that's not what I wanted to do forever. And the only way I was going to advance is to have a master's degree. But the master's degree of health administration is a professional designation. It's almost $40,000 for 2 years, and you don't qualify for student loans to get it. And there's no way I was going to qualify for a bank loan without a cosigner, which wasn't an option. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to have to work multiple jobs to make this work, which was challenging with dealing with all of my healthcare stuff. So I was just trying to find as many admin jobs that didn't require any physical labor to get her done.
And I appreciate your honesty on that so much. I can totally identify with that, coming from a low income family, and that whole loan stakeholdership is huge in pursuing education. It is wild. I even think it holds a lot of people back from applying to medicine. I don't think people realize that once you get into medicine, it is actually easy to fund your education, but all the steps previous to that, MCAT, master's degree, certifications, what have you, all comes out of pocket and it's extremely expensive. Was that kind of your overall take as well?
Yeah, that was like a big piece of it. I had thought of writing my MCAT in my undergrad, but I honestly couldn't afford it, nor could I afford a prep course. And the other piece is when I was with Doctors at BC, I was really lucky that my package was really well remunerated. It was the first time I ever had like a full pension and full benefits, not something anyone in my family had experienced. And so there was also a lot of anxiety of putting money towards medical school. And I talked to a lot of physicians about taking that leap because of going from a place of finally having financial security. I had just bought my condo. To take that leap was a really scary thing when you come from such financial insecurity. And I think a lot of people in medicine, or at least a lot of my colleagues, while they complained a lot about finances, understandably, always had a bit of a backup, or they knew that like they would be okay. And so that was something where I wanted to have like a good chunk of savings before I even started medical school, is because I just didn't know if anything was to happen health wise or whatever, would that be able to work out?
No, I think that's an extremely valid point to bring up. And it's the truth, honestly. You make decisions a little bit differently when you don't have plan B. A lot of this podcast, this little mini series we're doing, is focused on northern rural remote health and with a focus on family medicine. Would you say your love of family medicine came about from those very early years, or did it come along later? How did that kind of develop?
That's a great question. I get asked it a lot, and I think everyone has the stories of like, oh, their parents were physicians or their parents were nurses, or, and I had no family that was in healthcare, and so I was kind of out in my own. I really think that part of it came from just like the problem solving aspect I found of learning about kind of the medical conditions that my family had. And my great grandma ended up passing away of COPD, and I was there at 14 for her death. And I remember it just being a little bit traumatic. We didn't really have palliative care. And I just remember thinking, and it still stuck with me, like her gasping for breath and not being like really given any treatments to manage that. And I just remember thinking at that time that I wanted to be involved and like family medicine, managing chronic illness and making sure that kind of transition was smooth. I was always kind of interested in family medicine. I ended up working with my family doctor as an MOA in high school. And but a lot of family doctors were really hesitant. They would not encourage family medicine because the fee for service models, the hours, it can be a really challenging profession unless you love it. But like what really sealed the deal for me is I did the integrated community clerkship program in third year, which 8 of the northern medical students do. And I was based with a practice that I absolutely just like fell in love with. My two preceptors were amazing. Dr. Wenzel Smith was from South Africa, and just this powerhouse who would run like 10K to the hospital, do MAID, do surgical assist, just like do everything. And Dr. Williams herself had come from kind of like a low income family on a farm, like family of 7. And so it was like the first time in my professional career where I felt like I was at home. I didn't have to hide my background. I didn't have to be ashamed of my background, because a lot of times people would ask, oh, what did your parents do? And they get uncomfortable and change the subject. And working with kind of the populations that they had, and they attracted kind of more vulnerable populations, just really affirmed for me that that's what I wanted to do, and where I needed to be. It was kind of my calling, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I remember the first time we chatted, you kind of mentioned that you had wanted to do family medicine or had a strong inkling towards it from the beginning of medical school. And it's really interesting to hear how the experiences you had reinforced it during your time here. And you're a student of the Northern Medical Program originally, which we are affirming on this podcast is one of the best, if not the best, distributed site at UBC. So just so everyone knows, do you feel like going to the integrated clerkship and being at the Northern Medical Program continued to be like a special environment to reinforce the value of family medicine to you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, unfortunately, I don't know if you had the same thing where you started in Vancouver, but my year, I think, was one of the last ones to start in Vancouver. And everyone just assumed that you only went to the Northern Medical Program because you couldn't get into Vancouver. And I was always quite rude and said, like, I actually ranked Prince George first and I didn't even rank Vancouver. And the reason being is such the strong like family medicine community, being GP run hospital. And then I think, unfortunately, the Northern Medical Program became, oh well, only you only go there if you want to be a GP. But I found that like we had a lot of surgeons in our graduating class. You get a lot of exposures and opportunities to work. I wasn't there for my third year, but did all of my fourth year electives primarily there. And then the ICC program was no different. It was really viewed as like a family medicine program. And I definitely think that's its strong suit. But family medicine is so diverse. And having been from that site, there was a lot of opportunities for people to do work they would have never been done elsewhere because there's just no residents there. I've never really worked with residents. And in my ICC class, one is now in ortho, one's dermatology, one's pediatrics. So I just don't think it's just family medicine, but it really does create a well-rounded candidate because you do get the option to have like your own patient panel in third year, whereas all the other programs are only 4 weeks. And so having a year longitudinal practice was really eye-opening and really reaffirming that that's what I wanted to do with family medicine.
Yeah, I think we're the last year to go down to Vancouver for a whole semester. We now just do a week down there. And I think honestly, that's enough for me personally. I'm kind of the same boat as you. I chose a smaller city town to go to medical school. So I'd rather be there kind of learning. And I think that stereotype is still definitely out there about the family medicine and it being tied to the NMP. But I'm super glad to hear that, like, you felt like it was balanced and you also felt like you could still pursue that family medicine lens without like stigma. I honestly do feel like if you want to know family medicine, this is genuinely the best place to come just because there's so many people well versed in the wider range of things that family medicine has to offer you. So I think you played it smart by coming to the NMP.
I agree. And also my border collie and my husband love it. So family is a big focus. We went from a little apartment to having a house with a backyard, which was great during COVID.
And that's something else that people don't talk about. The NMP definitely offers like that lower cost of living. So you can own a place. I actually just bought a place this summer myself because I can't afford it in Prince George. I wouldn't be able to afford it elsewhere in BC, probably.
Which is amazing. And I think outside of February and March, which I will admit are horrific months and are very ugly, every time the rest of the year, I'm like, why would I ever leave? It's so gorgeous, so much nature, so much scenery. We live in a very beautiful area. We still have our house. And I just think people really don't understand the benefits that it offers and how welcoming the community is. It was so easy to meet people and so easy to make friends. And so many patients were so willing to work with you as a student. It was quite amazing experience.
No, that's great to hear. Just kind of like fleshing out a few things that happened during medical school for you. So, during medical school, you were still continuing to manage a chronic illness and you were working part-time. How did that kind of balance look for you week to week, day to day? How'd you make that work? Because I think a lot of medical students would be jealous to know how you got so much done during your undergraduate studies.
I got made fun of a lot for my over organization, so I don't know if anyone was jealous. But because UBC offers lecture recordings, I never knew at what point I would get sick, and it could come at any point. And so I always knew that I had to be prepared. So in any break that I had, I would always listen to lectures 1 week in advance. So I was always 1 week ahead, and that was really beneficial to be prepared for when that happened. I always knew it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. I have really severe asthma, and definitely with COVID, I had pneumonia twice with it, was hospitalized once. And in my first year of medical school, ended up having a stroke and ended up getting diagnosed with a shingles neuralgia and was unable to like use my hands. by one hand, my right hand, which was my writing hand, and student affairs had really encouraged me to take a year leave. And I just like did not feel that was the option. And the only way I didn't take a lead was just having the mindset of that you can do anything 10 minutes at a time. And so I would just study for 10 minutes a time, literally around the clock. And I think also just supports like reaching out to family and friends and just saying I'm struggling. My husband was a great help during that time. We bought a lot of HelloFresh, not sponsored, and just prepared meals that way. We did just whatever we had to do to survive. And that's unfortunately the life of someone with chronic illness.
That's so funny you bring up the HelloFresh because that is very much a thing in medical school. Like the amount of people that use those boxes is insane. So definitely no judgment if you get into medical school and get HelloFresh subscription immediately. I think that's the thing to do.
I always told people that I like was a big proponent of working smarter, not harder. I had like all of my groceries delivered and would order them in on an app. I had saved lists that I would save it. If we didn't do HelloFresh, just because if money was tight or whatever, we would have like the same meals that we would just have like on repeat. It was quite hilarious, like all of the tips and tricks that we both kind of developed to save any amount of time.
No, I think that's fantastic and gold for our listeners because a lot of people are pre-med or just starting medical school. So stuff I wish I knew in advance of medical school because it takes up a lot of time. You did the integrated clerkship at UBC, which is the idea that during third year studies, you go to a community and spend your entire year there of clinical learning all in one place with the same team, obviously moving though through different specialties on a week to week basis versus maybe a rotational one where you move every month. For you, you went to Duncan. Can you tell me a little bit about the Duncan site and what that looks like for people who may be interested?
Huge shout out to the Duncan site. I had quite a few NMP people who had done it the year prior to me, and they were really encouraging of going there and that they were kind of really supportive of people with chronic illness. So I just had kind of reached out to the program and just was really transparent about some of my concerns, and just the response that I was given was amazing. And student affairs helped facilitate that conversation, which is what kind of led me to apply there. Another bonus is being on the island. I wanted to be in an area where I would have support, and my husband had a lot of work on the island, and I still had friends and family there. And then also just kind of hearing about the bit of the population. A lot of the population is Indigenous. There's a lot of low SES, and there's a lot of elderly population, and there's a huge kind of palliative care MAID community. And all of those things I was really interested in. And so that kind of attracted me to that area as well. And just like kind of a wonderful place. And at the time was much more affordable for rent than the other ICC sites I was also looking at.
And honestly, I don't think I've met anyone who's done an ICC that didn't enjoy it. I think everyone who goes to these places truly loves the learning there because it's so personalized. Was that your experience as well?
Yeah. Stacy, who the coordinator is there, wants us to say it's not personalized learning. We have to have set rotations and set shifts that we do, which is very true for like the first half. But once you do your time and you prove that you're professional and you prove that you kind of show up on time, there's really a lot of opportunities outside that. And so, as I mentioned, I was really interested in palliative care, and no one else was really. So I got to do kind of a lot of geriatrics work, and I also got to do a lot of palliative care. And so almost had a whole unit in that type of work. And some other people were interested in surgery, and so got to do some subspecialty. And so it was really kind of tailored towards the end for a specific interest.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's fair. I think the word tailored, like you said, is probably better. I imagine too, though, it comes across as personalized in the sense that the staff just get to know you as a person a little bit because you're there longer. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, it's great because like you get to know the nurses and the unit clerks, and they like kind of know who you are. Our photos are up around the hospital, and they don't have a ton of learners. And I think also it's just you get to know them like as you are as a person. For me personally, kind of going into it with some medical conditions, I don't know how I would have been able to do like a traditional clerkship year, because like how it works, you might do like 1 or 2 days in one area, and then the next day you do an area in another area, and so on and so forth, and then you always have one day in family medicine at the end of the week. And so I ended up in my third year being diagnosed with another heart arrhythmia and just had an ablation in this past fall. And so they were able to like move around my surgery dates because they were trialing different medications and I wasn't cleared to actually be in the operating room. So had I been in my like third year traditional, that wouldn't have been able to be accomplished. I would have been needing to take a year off, or like I don't know how I would have finished my rotations. And so in that way it's really personalized and they get to know you, who you are as a person. So they always knew that I was like hardworking, always showed up on time, happy to stay late, but they could always tell like when I wasn't well or if I needed accommodations. And so I think that aspect of it is really beneficial as well. You become like a person and not just a medical student.
That's a fantastic way to frame the ICCs, I think. This is kind of lesser spoken about, and it's okay if you don't feel comfortable chatting about it. But did you seek any accommodations in medical school? And did you find that process was pretty straightforward? And I guess I just ask for people who are on the fence if they think they could manage medical school without accommodations. What's your kind of thoughts on that?
That's a really great question. For people that like are listening in medical school, there is like a grassroots UBC disability Facebook group where a lot of people post their experiences. I'll be candid because I'm blunt and I was a student affairs rep and I talked about a lot of my concerns about this is that unfortunately in some of the other sites when people have come forward with concerns, they've been automatically encouraged to report them to the college, and that's been a really big downside. Also, people have had difficulties with their accommodations. I was pretty lucky in that I had Dr. Atia, who was our student affairs lead, and for people who don't know her, she's just the most amazing, kind person. She always worked with me and wanted me to succeed. And so she was the one who initiated reaching out to accommodations. She was the one who initiated reaching out to like the ICC program. She was the one who initiated reaching out to some of my fourth year preceptors. And when I was on student affair meetings, that didn't happen in other sites. So I think it's kind of hard to navigate. What people also aren't aware of is we have a dedicated person in accommodations for the UBC medical program. I initially had reached out on my own upon encouragement from another student affairs advisor. I found it was pretty easy to get them done. All I had was like a doctor's note, but I also didn't really have like very specific accommodations. They were more regarding around exams. And because I did the ICC program, I talked with the site lead and he said, I would just really recommend you being professional. And so I would approach preceptors and say, hey, like today I'm having like a really bad arrhythmia day. I feel like there is a risk that I could pass out or faint. I don't think it's safe enough for me to be in the operating room standing. Like, can I work in the clinic or can I like sit or can I work in anesthesia, and just be really transparent. I know that a lot of people feel like they shouldn't have to do that or that's not fair. And I agree with that to an extent, but I think at the end of the day, patient care is the biggest priority. So it requires a lot of introspection to say, can I actually show up to work today and what is that going to look like? And then I think people, if they're about to enter medical school and they're not sure how it will be frustrating. Most people in medicine are very able bodied. Most of your preceptors are able bodied. And a lot of chronic illness comes from people from low SES statuses. And they'll say maybe eat better or exercise better and just be completely out to lunch of what that actually looks like. And so that can be just really isolating and lonely. And so I've been really vocal about posting on any of my socials or any of our Facebook groups and have had a lot of people reach out about that. But also, I think a bit of the onus is also on ourselves. I knew that family medicine was probably one of the only careers that I could do. Obstetric is fun, but like I'm never going to be able to do the call, and thinking that I should get accommodations isn't fair to any of my colleagues in future, just the way that medicine is designed. Nor would it be reasonable for me to do surgery when I know that any one point I could wake up and not be able to do it. And so I think people need to be really introspective and think, okay, what career is it that they're able to do? I was also really interested in ER medicine, but I found those shifts tiring and could potentially flare up. And also, you're more exposed to respiratory illnesses, which wouldn't be good for my asthma. And so I just really was like, okay, like family medicine, I fortunately ended up loving and was my passion all along. But I think people need to be really honest with themselves about what careers they can actually do.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point of view. It's super balanced and fair to say, I think, all of those things. There's onus on the school, there's onus on the learner. And that coming to choosing a specialty, I think is something that's never been brought up on this podcast before, but is super valuable for people to factor into their specialty algorithm. I don't think it's fair to say everyone can do every specialty because I don't think that's true for many reasons. Yeah, interesting.
I agree. And I think it's something that I had a lot of pushback when I would talk about in student affairs meetings. And in an ideal world, you could make accommodations for any condition. But at the end of the day, also in a real world, if you're especially in rural medicine, there is only so many specialists to cover call. And you can't, like, I would just personally feel so guilty about making my fellow colleague do 1 and 2 call because I've bailed. That's kind of my own personal values.
Yeah, no, I align with that completely. Just getting into the ICC a little bit more, because we've been chatting around it. When you go to the Northern Medical Program, there is a certain number of students that are required to enter the integrated clerkship just because of the limited training spots in smaller communities, which makes sense. And there's a few sites around the province. There's Terrace, Trail, sometimes Vernon, sometimes Fort St. John. But you decided to go to Duncan, or you chose to apply to Duncan. Can you tell listeners a little bit about the process of applying? Because it's almost like a mini CARMS, isn't it?
Yeah, our year was also really transparent. We put out a spreadsheet for who people were ranking first and second, or if they were not ranking sites. So I, in the end, had debated between Vernon and Duncan, but only ended up ranking Duncan. What happens with it is there's an application that comes out. You first kind of read about it in second year around October, and the application process is due in November. It's a personal letter, and I would really encourage for the personal letter, if you have a specific site that you want to do, just make that clear. Just kind of treated it like a cover letter for a job. And I know that a lot of medical students have never done this type of thing before, and so it was a really like nerve-wracking process. So I would start early with that, but just talk about your experiences as to why you think you would be a good fit for the site. Let's say you're really interested in ortho, like why Duncan? Oh, you heard that there's 2 female orthos and you want that mentorship. Okay, great. What experience have you had in ortho? Like, were you involved in sports? Were you involved in like physio work or any type of that thing? And so that's how I treated it. Then you kind of have an interview process after that. That's a generalized interview, it's not site specific. And then you go into the magic land, kind of similar to CARMS, and they spit out a result for you. I do think the process is great, and that personal letter you write for ICC can be really beneficial to begin the process for your CARMS letters as well.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. Like, did you think applying to ICC was actually helpful in preparing you to apply for a CARM spot?
Yeah, definitely. I included a resume when I applied for ICC. I don't know if they still allow that. Like, I try and update my resume every couple months with every flex project or volunteer project I'm involved in. It was a good reminder for like a lot of students who had never like some students had never created a CV. Again, being an old student, I'm laughing, which isn't quite fair to the younger listeners, but it's something that people should start sooner. I say like a good resume takes 100 hours, and I just helped my husband write one, and he had his first draft and we were laughing at like how bad it is, and he took the time and it's much better now. And so I would say, like, if you don't have a resume, if you've never written a cover letter, start early with the ICC program process, and same with CARMS.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. Super informative. And I'm super glad we chatted just about like who's a good fit for the program in terms of like, it doesn't just have to be someone who's family medicine oriented and just be anyone who wants that long term learning. Looking back on your ICC and now being a resident, is there anything you would have done differently to optimize your learning opportunities?
I don't think so. I'm not someone that looks back and has regrets, so I don't know if that's the best question for me. The only thing is, I did hear from an IC student, and I think it's fair to share her perspective, and she didn't love the ICC program. For some people, they really prefer like a traditional block rotation model where they have 4 weeks to learn and become masters. The ICC program, you don't master anything because you do one day and then you switch on to the next. There isn't even really time to study it because you're not going to study everything in the one night before. It's really patient focused, and you'll more focus on the patient preparation and the patient cases. That being said, you also can't forget anything. So if you hate internal medicine, you're going to be doing internal medicine through the entire year, and there's like no getting around it. ICC, you really are able to follow patients. So I was able to see a few patients in the GP office, in the internal medicine office, in the oncology office, and they would book them specifically knowing that I had seen them previously.
No, I think that's a genuine thing to bring up, 100%. Electives, where you're switching up constantly, is fourth year. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, in fourth year, most sites don't have enough electives within one site. So, although I tried to primarily do Prince George, I did have to leave for 4 electives in total. So, it was 2.5 months in total I had to leave. And that was kind of just like hard leaving my family and kind of just having to travel for that, because a lot of the time you do need your car because of depending on being on call, or unless you can get like a place really close to the hospital, which in Victoria I had to pay $2,000 for 2 weeks, so that stuff is just hard.
Absolutely. I think that's such an interesting perspective too, because fourth year I feel like is such a whirlwind. Did you feel like, as someone who just entered the Okanagan program, made the transition from medical school, was there anything special you had to do to prepare for residency?
If there was, I didn't do it.
I highly doubt it. You seem super prepared.
I know that a lot of people I heard from like did study on their breaks. Like when you finish your last elective and have CARMS, that's in March, and then you go back to school and do 4 weeks of like preparing for residency. So they review like all of the kind of guidelines and everything, and then you study for your MCQE. Some people like wrote it right away. I gave myself 3 weeks. So I did feel that was kind of like a good review to review some of the clinical material. And then most people do some of their like training programs like ACLS during that time, the initial NRP, to kind of get prepared. That's all I did, and I didn't do anything else other than like the mandatory UBC modules that don't go away in residency, just FYI. But I know other people that I chatted with like really brushed up on their area, especially specialty where it's like more specific that they were doing more studying. But for family medicine, like you could study until the end of the time and you'll never learn it. So I don't know. I just enjoyed my time off and tried to really recharge. I just really wanted the time to spend with family, especially since I'm away from my husband right now. And I think sometimes like focusing on your own wellness is the best preparation for residency.
Cannot agree more. I think that's gold advice for everybody. So you applied through CARMS last year and you ended up matching, like we mentioned, to the Okanagan program. Can you tell me a little bit about that program, what it's like, how it's structured?
Yeah, so I was really attracted to the Okanagan program just via some of the information that was provided. When you begin the CARMS process, they'll have site specific like info sessions. And so I knew that I was really interested in either the UBC or the Dalhousie program. And so I attended those like general programs, and then from there had learned a bit more about the sites, and then attended 5 specific sites within BC, just trying to learn about the local culture. And so the one thing that was really appealing on Penticton right away is there was a lot of female residents. For me personally, like, my husband and I would be looking at a family within the next couple years. And so wanted to ask, like, what is it? How is supports looking like for families? And then like more learning specific, they had talked right away about the coordinator, Kristen, and I had an amazing coordinator in the ICC program, Stacy. And without her, I don't know how I would have survived the year. She just kept us so on task. And as someone who's been in MOA, like having a great program coordinator is like worth their weight in gold. And so I had emailed with her quite a bit and was just so impressed. And then the Penticton program is longitudinal in nature, which is very similar to the ICC. So regardless of your electives, you always spend half a day or a day a week in the family practice office. So even if you're on like surgery or an internal medicine and you're just like, I can't imagine doing 4 weeks of this, at the end of the week, or mine was always Fridays in ICC. So I'm like, no matter what, I'll finish the week on a good note. But you always get that kind of option to finish or do something that week that you loved. And that's what I hated about fourth year. If I was on elective that I wasn't super into, I didn't have that break. So that was super appealing to me. There was a huge emphasis on wellness, and it seemed like actually sincere. You know, a lot of people talk about wellness and resiliency, and then they say, oh, we break the call rules. We expect 1 and 2 calls for these shifts, and that's beneficial for your learning. It was like very transparent what their call requirements are and that they never deviate from it.
Yeah.
I know that family medicine is more of a privilege and there's more opportunities and sites, but I would strongly say that in any job, the interview goes both ways. So make sure you ask pointed questions because you don't want to be stuck at a site that doesn't work for you.
Oh my gosh, no, I think that's amazing and segues perfectly into like the next thing I was going to say, which is, I've been trying to get people's takes on like some of the common stereotypes associated with family medicine in this podcast. And one of them that is huge in medical school, and I'm sure you experience it as well, is I hear a lot of classmates often saying, I don't need any publications, I don't need any extracurriculars, I don't need any work experience because I'm just going to do family medicine and they'll take anybody. What's kind of your thought on that?
I mean, to be honest, they're probably not wrong, but I just think that's kind of like a bad attitude to have. And so I had like a lot of classmates be like, oh, well, you don't have to worry, for sure you're going to get an interview. And they're not wrong. You will get an interview. But I also had people in family medicine not match to the first or second choice. And it became apparent the people who didn't match, except for a couple exceptions, because CARMS is weird and you go into this weird abyss where people like didn't necessarily maybe put into the time to express why they wanted to do family medicine. And so I don't think publications are as important in family medicine, and that's a bit of my bias. But like, are you involved in any like rural interest groups? Do you have any leadership experiences? How do you give back to your community? Family medicine recognizes that they're one of the professionals that is like really involved in advocacy work, for example. And so if you're not going to be someone that's willing to be involved in your community, which so many family doctors are involved in, then I think that's going to come across on your application.
Like, it's almost like, do you have a growth mindset or not? Because no matter what medicine you're going to do, you need a growth mindset,
Mhm.
in my opinion, anyway.
I agree. And I think also it becomes really harmful when people are like, well, I'm going to just back with family medicine. And the Dalhousie program is like super sassy and I adored them, but they said like right away they can tell who is like backing up with it. And I thought that was amazing because family medicine is a specialty that so many people would quickly get out of because if it's not for you, like the pay isn't amazing, the hours aren't great, there's a lot of paperwork. So unless you love like a longitudinal practice, and I get that, at the end of the day you want to match, but if you are genuinely have no interest in family and you're only backing for your CARMS application, like maybe do some self-reflection.
Totally.
That sounded very harsh again.
No, I don't think that sounded harsh. I think that sounds real. Agree with it. In your mind, is there any benefit to building a competitive family medicine application?
Um, that's a good question. I'm umming and hawing on this one.
That's okay.
I think that a competitive family application might mean different things to different people. I'm not like our class president. I did like our student affairs rep role, didn't do any publications during medical school. And I found that I think I had a pretty competitive application. And I think a lot of that came from like my previous job experience. I think a lot of people just like get hung up on like publishing a journal article in Flex, and that's not really going to reflect how good of a family medicine candidate you are. And think about like certain work experiences or like actual experiences that are beneficial. One of my preceptors had told me that they love any applicants that's like worked at McDonald's or Starbucks because they like will understand the process of multitasking and how to work quickly or understand like the flow of a clinic. So I think that is what makes you more of a competitive application than speaking at like X conference or X publication.
Love that answer. Yeah, that sounds like any job you would just want people to be well-rounded. And I think family medicine's approach to that is awesome.
And I think they have a huge focus on like the whole, like UBC in general has a whole focus on the complete package as a student. But I think their family medicine residency program, even based on the interview questions, they're very much looking for like a well-rounded person, and they want someone that is a person, because you're not going to be able to relate with your patients. And I mean, that's what you want in a family medicine. Like, you go to a hairdresser because they cut your hair well, but you still want to like be able to chat and speak with them. And family medicine is no different. It's different than like a neurosurgeon where the patient's passed out half the time. We just want like the smartest person in the room. But for family medicine, communication is so important. And so if you don't have any of those life skills, you're going to really struggle.
That's legitimate. I have been trying in each of my podcast episodes to talk to people about the logistics of call, because I think that is something that people are going into medicine now might not be thinking about, but it is a huge part of the job in some ways. And you kind of talked about, call is tough for you in many ways with the dark cloud and health conditions. Can you tell me, when you're in ICC, how often you were doing call, and then residency, what's call looking like?
So it's I'm just kind of comparing, and remember, this is kind of during COVID times. And so I feel like ICC, when I talk to my other like third year students, is we did more call, but the call wasn't as hard, if that makes sense. With a lot of the ICC programs and rural sites in general, you can do like home call. So as long as you live within a distance where you're called and you can walk through the doors of the hospital within 15 minutes. So I chose to live like 9 to 10 minutes away, and I'm currently 5 minutes away, so that by the time I find parking and change into my scrubs, like I'm ready to go. But the flip side of that is, because you're expected to be able to like sleep through the night, you don't really have any post call days. So if you're an insomniac like me and you need medications to sleep at night, which isn't a doable thing when you're on call, that can be really challenging. The ICC program, besides maternity though, would kind of limit it for the most part till 11 the night before, so you really like got a good night's sleep. You're also expected to do like one weekend of family call practice a week, and my family preceptor like rounded on their patients in the morning, and then we worked in the walking, and then maybe do like a maid after that, and then maybe go back for an admit. And then in residency, I selected the program based upon that. Like my call now is very similar to ICC call. It's just call to 11, and then you like are expected to work the next day. So they don't do like post call days, which for some people they would rather have that post call. But for me, like I'd rather like at least get 6 hours of sleep and like try to function versus like getting my sleep schedule all messed up. And then you're supposed to do one weekend a month. And so far the call has seemed like very reasonable. I did like a 7 to 11 p.m. shift on Sunday, and I was just like up because I just don't function, but they said that you don't really get called until noon, and so it only ended up being like 6 hours that I was there in total, so that's like pretty manageable.
Thanks for laying all that out. That's going to be super helpful to listeners. You're just brand new, obviously, to the family medicine Okanagan, so if you don't want to answer this, totally okay. But do you think you will have a typical day in the life in your family medicine program? And if so, what might that be?
So most of the stuff is out of Penticton. Unfortunately, with like rural programs, there is some travel for electives, both in first and second year, but primarily we're based in the site, although we do some like outreach to Princeton and Oliver. So far, like I kind of have found residency very similar to third year, in that I've treated residency like a job, and we are getting paid now. And so it's kind of like are normally scheduled to start for 8 a.m. And so I always get there a few minutes early, try and review any charts that I didn't get a chance to review beforehand. You do your shift, and then you like do any preparations for the next day that you're on, any like chart reviews or anything like that. And so I try and do like, think of it like a 10-hour day where I do like my work and then have like my couple hours of paperwork in the evening. And I think that's pretty reflective of most jobs professionally, and also pretty reflective of like what it will be like as a family physician.
I just have one question left for you, but it's kind of a big one and it's kind of a two-parter. So hang on there with me. For you, what does the future of rural health and medicine look like in both a clinical setting and a personal setting?
Systems wise, rural medicine, I think, has had a lot of attraction as of late because BC housing costs are just astronomical. And so a lot of rural centers is like the only way for people to be able to afford to live. And I think people through COVID like really learned what it was like to work from home or be based from home, and really like a value more of like a close knit community and outdoor spaces. And so it seems like a really exciting time for rural medicine. I like being part of a GP run hospital. Yes, it's a lot of responsibility, but it's also really exciting. We're just not like paper pushers referring on to specialists. You get to do procedures. You're really involved in like kind of serious situations. On Sunday, we got called in for a hemorrhagic stroke, a PE, like a code white, and respiratory distress. And that doesn't happen at other sites. Like the internal medicine team would take it, or like other response teams would take that. And so I think it's a really good way to stay up on your skill set and still really enjoy like a lot of the aspects of family medicine. And then I think like the biggest thing in rural family medicine is just like the sense of community, is you get to know everyone, and the relationships with specialists is so much less of that divide of you're a specialist and I'm a family doctor and I know what you're saying and you don't. Like I've met a few of the specialists and they're already so welcoming and so excited to kind of like get to know you. And of course, there's always those exceptions, but I think it's much more of like a collaborative and collegial community. And what I had said about ICC is you become like a person, not a medical student. And I firmly feel in rural family medicine is the person is emphasized. Like people know if you have kids and stuff comes up, like people are people outside of medicine. I do think it's like important that people recognize that medicine at the end of the day is a job. And while we're hugely privileged to be part of this job, that burnout is a real thing, and passion can be easily lost when we don't have time to take care of ourselves. And so I think rural medicine helps facilitate a sense of community and personhood that allows you to take care of yourself.
That's a beautiful outlook. As someone who has a very strong leadership, advocacy, and business sense background, what do you think your future practice is going to look like?
Everyone begin to think of this question, because you'll be asked for it if you're in ICC, you'll be asked for it in residency, you'll be asked during it in CARMS. It's like literally the number one question you get asked all the time. So I'll try not to sound like I have a rehearsed answer, but I'll come back to just to be kind of a little bit more like open-hearted with the response. Is the physician I worked with in Duncan, Dr. Wenzel Smith, is if I could be her one day, I feel like I would have won the lottery. There's no way I would have her stamina, but she's just continued to learn at every step of the way. She's done like a +1 in surgery, a +1 in psychiatry, a +1 in like end of life care. And she's just constantly learning and passionate about medicine. While that can be unrealistic and not like super healthy, it was also a reminder that it is possible to remain the passion. And so I think what opened up for me is like just constantly changing up things that you do, like get involved in different groups, be open to things, like don't become cynical with the healthcare system. It's so easy, especially since we've all been training in COVID. And I think also, like, she taught me that a lot of times people can get really hung up on the patients they see and the difficult patients. And she told me that most difficult patient should become your favorite patient. And that was like a huge mind shift for me. I'm like a very value oriented person, and so when someone like doesn't adhere to my values, I can come like very closed off. And so she's like, they'll become your favorite person. And so I worked with someone in internal medicine that like no one wanted to work with in my 4th year, and he was like an anti-vaxxer and ended up having like a heart attack from COVID, and people kind of just brushed him off. And he ended up like, I struggled with him the first day, and I called her and I remember her being like, don't forget your passion. They're a patient. Find a way to connect with him. And he ended up being one of my favorite patients, and he gave me like a gift at the end. And I just remember him so well. And so I think I want my future practice to be kind of an odd group mix of misfits that we all kind of work on together, and that's constantly evolving. And whether I go back to do a +1 in geriatrics or palliative later in my career, that remains to be seen, but just try and being involved in a lot of different things, which is the benefit of family medicine.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Wyllie, for your time and for chatting with us. This podcast, I know, is going to help so many people out there, especially those in the UBC system right now or wanting to enter the UBC medical school. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Cannot say it enough.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's Allyson, not Dr. Wyllie.
Thank you, Allyson.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you would like to hear more from the Metamorphosis podcast, please be sure to check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else podcasts are available. Take it easy, and we hope to see you next time.
This has been a presentation of the UBC Medicine Learning Network.